So I really do want to just say that it's a massive honor for me to introduce our next speaker, Zara Raji, who is one of the co-founders of Uzenzele Holdings. Zara is a rainmaker, I think, and she's a facilitator. And if you've got a business that requires funding or a grant, Zara is the right person to speak to because Uzenzele connects people. It connects people who require funding and grants with those people that are in a position to provide the funding and the grants. And just to give you an idea, um, they've secured in excess of 1.3 billion rand for projects in the recent past. So I'm going to let Zara tell us all about Uzenzele Holdings, and hopefully she can inspire all of us. Thank you, Zara.
Hi, everyone. Yes, thank you so much. My name is Zara. I am, as mentioned, I am a co-founder and director of Uzenzele Holdings. And what we do is we assist businesses that are looking for capital for various things, find that capital in the market. And what I'm going to be speaking about today is funding intellectual property. So, a lot of the time the question is, how do we go about securing our IP and what funding is available for research and development in South Africa? And so I'm going to focus on two funds today. The first one I'm going to speak about is Section 11D of the Income Tax Act, which is a tax incentive. And essentially what that is, it's managed by the Department of Science and Innovation together with Treasury and SARS. And what it is a tax deduction calculated based on research and development spend by a company. And the second one I'm going to speak about is the Export Marketing Investment Assistance Cash Grant. So that's actual cash that is, it's managed and administered by the DTIC, the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. And it is cash that is given to businesses in South Africa to assist them with exporting activities, so both marketing and IP protection. And I am going to focus on the IP protection side today. So if we look at the Section 11D tax incentive, what does it really essentially do? The purpose of it and the reason it was implemented is that the South African government wanted to offer an incentive to give South African companies a push towards research and development. The view is, yes, there is a cost associated with this. However, how do we actually get companies to invest in their research and development? Because that investment results in greater growth for the economy, more innovation, more products being developed, more export opportunities, etc., as well as the development of IP therefrom. And as much as there's this view to move IP offshore, there's also a push by government to keep IP in South Africa because of the benefits of licensing, etc., that will bring here. So it is a crucial aspect in terms of boosting innovation in the business sector and improving competitiveness and growth for the economy. Just quickly, before I jump into this, the R&D tax incentive has a sunset clause, which is set for December of next year. However, it is in the process of being extended with some changes, but essentially we're looking at an additional 10 years on that. So hopefully we'll be seeing that this will go on until the 2030s. All right, so what the incentive is, it's available to any South African company, and that's a PTY, undertaking scientific or technological research and development within South Africa. And those companies can then deduct up to 150% of their R&D spending when determining their taxable income. So this is where now the linkage comes in with SARS. The incentive is available to businesses of all sizes and in all sectors of the economy that are doing research and development. And I'll speak about what that might mean. It is, of course, most valuable for companies that have some tax revenue that they're going to have to pay over. So for profitable companies, because what we're talking about is a tax deduction. So this is where it really becomes valuable. And for those companies doing significant R&D, new inventions, new innovations, looking at areas that have never been looked at before, that can really end up costing quite a lot. If we look at industries like pharmaceutical industry, there's a lot of spend that goes into developing a new drug or a new treatment. There's clinical trials, etc. So those are the sorts of costs that can be covered from the likes of the R&D incentive. Okay, the eligibility criteria, really important. It needs to be a company as defined by the Income Tax Act, cannot be a trust or an NPO, a public entity. It needs to be a private company, essentially, that needs to actually incur the expenditure. So it can't be, it can't be like, it can't be sweat equity. It can't be the people that have donated their time or their resources. It needs to be actual rand expenditure that has gone into developing that R&D, and it must be undertaken in South Africa. So, if you're going to employ an external company, an international company to do some of that R&D, that R&D needs to still be done in South Africa. So ideally, they should have an office in South Africa. If you're going to be doing R&D for a company abroad, again, the R&D needs to take place within the borders of South Africa as a South African company. There is room for things like JVs, etc. And this is a very, very comprehensive and detailed incentive. There's a lot of nuances. There's a lot of intricacies to it. Because of this, in order to be eligible for this incentive and what qualifies as an R&D activity, it must meet the definition of research and development in the Act, within Section 11D of the Act. It must be innovative and novel. Now, what is innovative and novel? This is where most of the issues come up with this incentive, is being able to determine that innovation, that aspect of innovation and that aspect of novelty. It really does come down to a great degree to the project, to the industry, to what is being researched. And so within each of these applications that go forward to the Department of Science and Innovation, there is a lot of adjudication, there's a lot of investigation that takes place in order to determine whether or not these definitions of innovative and novel are met. And in order to do that, of course, there's a whole lot of investigation that takes place prior to putting an application together to ensure that we're actually addressing those two criteria. The other element is that it has to be applied for as a project, and the distinction needs to be made between a company project versus a research and development project. A company project has commercial purpose, whereas the purpose of a research and developmental project is for the advancement of scientific knowledge or for achieving technological advancement. So it's really important to keep that in mind. A lot of companies go, we're doing something innovative within our company, we're going to be doing business in a different way. That won't qualify for the research and development incentive. What it needs to be is, I would say, if I'm speaking to lawyers, something that can be patented or trademarked or copyrighted. It's something that doesn't already exist to a certain degree, or you're making a significant change to something that already exists. And that's what's really important when being able to determine whether or not a project will meet the requirements for this incentive. All right, where it fits in, and this is also super, super important when it comes to the incentive. It only fits in the discovery, the research phase of a project, and within the first step of the development and pre-commercialization phase. So your basic research, your applied research, design and engineering, and then technology development and prototype. The minute you go into testing your prototype and trying to commercialize it and engaging with the market and doing market research, this incentive no longer applies. There are other incentives that may be relevant. When you say that now I've done my prototype, I've tested the market, I want to put up a factory, there's other incentives that will fund that, etc. So here, this will fund all the way up to a prototype. And that's really super important to keep in mind, because if a lot of your cost sits post-prototype, that's not where you're going to get your incentive out of the Section 11D. All right, so that's Section 11D. It is a very complex incentive. There's a lot of nuance to it. There's two big institutions involved in it, that being the Department of Science and Innovation, DSI, and then SARS. And these two need to speak to each other. The process is essentially that you put in your application to DSI. They will then evaluate and adjudicate it. They will then send it to the director to sign off if it's approved, and they'll let you know that, yes, you have been approved for this incentive. You then go ahead and do your research and development and claim that deductible when you submit your returns to SARS. That can also be a little bit tricky. Nothing at SARS is straightforward, and now we're getting two institutions to speak to each other. Also, this is an incentive that, in my opinion, is um, not nearly used enough in South Africa. Has immense value. There's a lot to be gained for companies doing a lot of R&D. But because it isn't used a lot, SARS does sometimes struggle. So it is about ensuring that, you know, you're engaging with them and you're helping them through that process, or we help them through that process. If we look at the export marketing investment assistance, that's the second grant I want to speak of today. In short, it's EMEA. So this is for businesses that are looking to export. So South African businesses looking to export their product. Remembering, of course, when government is looking at incentives, is looking at grants, they're looking at how is that going to impact the South African economy. So when we look at all of these incentives, it's always for South African companies. IP must be registered in South Africa, or the original owner of IP must be a South African company, etc. But the purpose is to provide marketing assistance to develop new and export markets. It assists with identification of new markets through market research. It assists companies to increase their competitiveness by supporting patent registrations, quality marks, and product marks, and assists with the facilitation to grow foreign direct investment through missions and foreign direct investment research. And also it wants to support the contribution of Black-owned businesses and SMEs in South Africa. So essentially, when you look at this incentive, there's two main aspects. The marketing aspect being assisting businesses to go and showcase their product at expos. In foreign markets, and you know they'll cover things like the cost of your stand, your airfare, your accommodation, maybe a daily stipend, and getting your products there, the shipping of products to that event. And then the other thing is the cost of IP. So I want to talk about the cost of IP. What does that mean? And I'm sure a lot of people have heard about that situation where you go to, especially a country like China, and you know you showcase your product and all of a sudden you haven't sold a thing there, but all of a sudden your product is on the shelf. And that's really what it comes down to. It's not just about patents. Trademarks are so valuable. You know, we saw Coca-Cola, we saw Nestle up on the screen just a moment ago, and the reality is that those brands mean something, and often they get misused and they get stolen. So how do we protect ourselves? And the South African government has acknowledged that this is a problem for businesses going into foreign markets. So what they've done is they've created within this EMEA incentive the contribution towards supporting businesses to register their IP in export markets. Um, this is a capped grant, so where the research and development incentive is not capped. It's based on what you spend and your taxable revenue. This is based on the cost of registering your IP in those foreign markets, and it is capped to 100,000 Rand on a 50-50 basis. What does that mean? If you want to register a trademark in the United States, and the cost of doing so is 200,000 Rand, 50% of that could be funded as a grant, and a grant is money that is never paid back. So that's really fantastic. It reduces the cost of registering those marks. This is not for just one mark. You might be going to 2 or 3 different countries, and you know together your marks are going to cost you 150 to 100,000 Rand. 50% of that can come through as a grant, and that's per annum. All right, the eligibility criteria there is a South African registered company. Being tax compliant is really important. A minimum level BEE, level 4 BEE certification. Ideally, a South African manufacturer or a distributor of South African manufactured products. Registering software, IP, that sort of thing becomes a little bit more difficult. They really do prefer a product, but we are looking and investigating how we can move that forward into your more technology sort of space. And you must not have traded or introduced that product or mark into the country where the IP is being registered. So this is for new entrants into a market. And I want to just touch quickly on something called Smart Fund. So we've been very fortunate to be engaging with Adams and Adams over quite some time. And together with their commercial IP team in Johannesburg here, we have developed a service to assist clients to access this EMEA grant, this 100,000 Rand grant for registration of your marks in foreign markets. And essentially what happens is Adams and Adams will facilitate the process of applying for the registration of that IP in the foreign markets. We'll facilitate the process of applying for the grant, and together, really work towards getting that mark secured for you. And so if you're interested in joining that pilot, I urge you to please reach out to your usual Adams and Adams contact person, who will then make the relevant introductions and take the process forward. I feel like I spoke very fast, but that brings me to the end. And I'm more than happy to take any questions.
For you, and that relates to under the EMEA, if you developed, you spoke about goods that have been manufactured, but if you developed something like a software program and you wanted to roll that out, would you be able to get funding for that?
It's very tricky. And again, software is a difficult one, because at the end of the day, firstly, do you have some sort of trademark or copyright? You can't even register copyright, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, you
right?
can't.
So how do you actually prove that? And it becomes a little bit difficult to manage. What we can look at is the registering of that trademark in a foreign market, for a product that you're looking to take into a foreign market. Again, what is it based on? Are you using, a lot of companies approach us and say, I've developed the Uber of whatever their industry is. Well, that's not novel. What you've done is you've probably taken some white label existing infrastructure and software, and you've built on top of that. So can you really prevent someone from building their own? All they need to do is tweak the smallest thing, and you're out of the game. So that's where it becomes a little bit tricky, and why within EMEA, ideally product, a brand that is associated with actual product, is really quite important.
All right. Yes, we have a question from the audience. Just going to repeat the question. Yes, sorry, we got a request earlier just to repeat the question because some of our online guests aren't able to hear it. So the question just relates to whether there's a limit on the export countries and whether export countries include African countries only.
So any country that is not South Africa, the minute we send a product outside of our borders, we are exporting. So all countries outside of South Africa will qualify as an export market. That will include, for example, correct. That will include our neighboring countries as well. I mean, ideally, those sorts of events don't cost too much to go to. The IP there doesn't cost too much to register. We've done a few applications, and honestly, the time and process involved in registering, rather than applying for this grant, for anything less than sort of 75 to 100,000 rand, in terms of the cost of IP, it's not really necessarily worth it, if I can put it that way. Yeah.
I think that was load shedding, or we just turned the lights off.
I think the lights came back on.
We have another question back there.
Hi, Zahra. I've got a question. Is there any interplay between the tax incentive and the IPR Act, because they both speak to benefiting South Africa from the IP? So is there any interplay? And have you had who have used the IPR Act to their benefit, where they've used this funding?
So just to repeat the question, you asked, sorry, I didn't catch everything that you asked. You asked if there's a difference between...
Is there an interplay between the tax incentive and the IPR Act? They both speak to IP being used for the benefit of South Africa.
Okay.
And then has Uzenzele had any success with startups who have had public funding for research and development, but then use these tax incentives or funding for continuing their business?
Okay, so the interplay between them and the establishment of IP rights.
Yeah. So I think if, do you want to repeat the question?
No, it's
Can I
fine.
go ahead?
Yeah.
All right. So in terms of the interplay, these are two separate incentives, two separate departments. They don't necessarily work together. One important thing about the R&D incentive, actually an important thing when it comes to all incentives across these institutions, is that if you are receiving an incentive for one institution, you cannot use an incentive for another institution to fund the same thing. Keeping in mind, these come into play at different times. Your research and development incentive, remember, goes all the way through to that prototype stage. pre-commercialization. Your EMEA is now looking at your commercialization, going into export markets. So they're assisting businesses at different stages. With regards to accessing these incentives, what is as a startup, and that was the question. The research and development incentive, Section 11D, is not necessarily beneficial to a startup that doesn't have any turnover because you're not going to be paying any income tax. So that's where it really becomes valuable. However, if you have a large company that's assisting you to fund your research and development, they can claim the R&D tax incentive, so they can benefit from the support that they're giving a startup. So that's one way that a startup can maybe incentivize or convince a larger business to assist them with their R&D costs. With regards to EMEA, a startup business is going to struggle to get EMEA. The idea being that they're looking for businesses that are export ready. So if they're going to help you establish yourself in an export market, they want to know that once you're established, you're actually going to make moves to enter that market. It's not assisting you protect your IP for the sake of it.
Yes, another question.
It can take 5 years to develop a drug. Does this claim ever have to be put in the year in which the expense and it was incurred or the preceding year? What happens if you 12 years down the line now you have to take the next compensation?
So excellent question. And certainly they do understand that there are several research and development projects that are that require several years, and speak specifically to the pharmaceutical industry in that regard. There is a way in which to apply for multi-year incentives. So they have catered for that. It's a very complex process again, and there are certain requirements that need to be met. But in a nutshell, the incentive does cater for multi-year research projects. In terms of whether or not a project gets tanked at the end, well, that's what you're researching and developing, aren't you? You're determining whether or not this is something that can go to market. So the idea is to promote and incentivize innovation, research and development, and understanding that, yes, the project might not see the light of day, but also understanding that you're not getting all your money back. It's calculated on your tax, and at the end of the day, you're not going to spend money on something you don't think is going to ultimately see some benefit. So it's really incentivizing that portion, if that answers the question, I hope.
So coming off that, then I think there is a question that's come through here, which says that can incentives be claimed for past R&D or IP registrations?
Excellent question. This applies to all grants across the board. You have to apply first. If you've spent the funds already and you didn't consider or you didn't know, tough luck. Unfortunately, that's the view. Always apply first. With regards to the Section 11D, it's apply. You might not have your answer yet, so the answer might come back as no, but put in your application before you start investing. Again, this is for those companies that are going to invest anyways. It really makes sense to go down this route because there's a significant benefit there. With EMEA, you need to be applying before going into to register your patents. And with any of the other incentives that we look at across the board, whether it's for actually establishing manufacturing concerns or whatever the case might be, it's really, really important to first apply. Depending on the incentive, you may need to get your approval before actually even investing. In some, like 11D, you don't need your approval yet. You just need acknowledgement from DSI that they have received your application.
I mean, does this sound like an obvious question that EMEA is not available for local? So it has to be something that you're going to export. So you wouldn't be able to get that funding or that assistance
to register your trademarks.
Yes,
yeah.
yeah.
No,
Right,
unfortunately,
okay.
it is only for registration of your patents and marks in
Abroad,
export markets.
okay,
Yeah, so that
right.
funding will not assist you to register your patents and marks locally.
Maybe there's other funding.
Perhaps.
All right, I think we're good. Thank you, Zara. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. If there are no further questions.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks.